have, of course, three people who have given us ways to imagine and to revision the future. Before our conference draws to a close, one of the elements that we want to make sure we talk about is work, women and work. All of you know what work is, and we've talked about work in tangential ways throughout these 2 days, but we thought this would be an opportunity to talk about work. So we'd like to begin by asking our three panelists to talk about the work they've done and the work that they feel has made a difference to the world.
Don't we get to talk about the title?
Sure, you can.
That was everybody else got to talk about the title. I want to talk about the title.
Sure.
I, too, have been rehearsing.
Okay. Judy, I'm going to get you to lead off.
Okay, so everybody's complained about the public intellectual thing, and they've complained about discourse, so I want to complain about the other word, which I cannot remember because it makes no sense to me.
Discourse and dynamics?
Discourse and dynamics. I don't understand what that means. So I wanted to raise a question about that. And since everybody's raised the other questions, that was a question. What does it mean? And the thing is, about a name is important to remember, and this is part of communication. I have been here for 3 days, and I still had to ask you what the name of the conference was. So I would know what it means. What is discourse and I know what discourse means. I know what dynamics mean, but I don't know what discourse and dynamics mean, and I don't know how it relates to the conference.
Aretha and I have to change location so I can go to the mic.
Well, here, you could share mine. Sure.
I can share your mic.
Yeah, share mine.
The dynamics part is what we're doing this afternoon, is to get some interaction and some, not just discourse being talked at, being talked at is in sort of presentations and academic stuff, in academic presentations in the morning, but the dynamics of an exchange. And I think we were really concerned that you can talk, but at a certain point you have to walk, or you have to do something, you have to be dynamic, you have to take action. And so we were conscious of, on the one hand, of also a bit of an alliteration. The conference did take different forms in our email communications. There was also the CWPI Quippy. That was a short form we ended up using, and as opposed to D&D. But it was really the idea of not just talking as in discourse, conversation, but then taking it to a step of doing something, being dynamic. Certainly in the first instance, to have a follow-up in 2 years' time, but we heard about the plans for a conference that the students are organizing on leadership. So some sort of dynamism. Then there is the idea that you yourselves are very dynamic. That's how often you've ended up in the public domain, is you've been dynamic in some way. You've been dynamite, you've been Danes, you've been active, right? So it was that, and coming up with an expression to try to capture that.
I want to not complain. I have been rehearsing my non-complaint. I have become convinced over the last 2 days that I have been living under a rock somewhere, because I never heard the term public intellectual until 2 years ago, when someone wrote me a glowing letter of reference and said she is a very successful public intellectual. And I went, oh, that sounds great. But not only did it sound great, I've always had a label problem. You notice I have 3 ascriptions up here. When I was 30 years ago, Chatelaine made me one of the women to watch under 40. And they got very upset with me. I was living in Saskatchewan. They got very upset with me because they couldn't come up with one label for what I did. And this woman is interviewing me from Winnipeg, which is something that people in Saskatchewan get very upset about. She's interviewing me from Winnipeg, and she says, you have to say what it is you do. Why are you doing so many things? So I finally said, well, I suppose the good news about this is that I'm multi-talented. I can do more than one thing. But the bad news is, quite frankly, you may have noticed that I'm black. And when I am barred from doing one thing, when there's a big roadblock standing there that I can't, I do something else. I change the field. So I was very relieved to say, oh, I'm a public intellectual. That's what I am.
So as I'm sitting here, as what in the audience yesterday and today, I shook my head a couple of times on multiple occasions that, we're only paying attention to this term public intellectual when we're completely ignoring the label Canadian women. And we have to acknowledge whose history we're erasing when we call ourselves Canadian women. Because as an Indigenous woman, I don't identify as a Canadian woman. I am Indigenous before I am women. And I think that conversation is really important to have too, especially here on Persons Day. Because when you look at the history of the famous five, it's not very clean and sparkly as we would like to imagine it. It was very racist. And two of the famous five have actually advocated for the forced sterilization of Indigenous women and feeble-minded women, their terms, not mine. And they also advocated for the criminalization of prostitution. And sometimes when I raise that up, people bring that up, people say, well, we have to contextualize these women's lives during their time. No, we are still having these conversations today about criminalizing prostitution, which leads to the criminalization of Indigenous women's lives, and these conversations are important to have.
Bravo.
Not to mention the foreign-born, of whom I am one. So that was a little Nellie McClung problem.
And that is why it was called Discourse and Dynamics, because we knew that we would get to, we hoped, to the moment of dynamic. And part of the discussion has to get to a moment of change. That's, otherwise, why would we spend all this time talking?
Okay, so now you want me to talk
You want to
about
talk
work?
about work?
Your turn now, Judy, yes.
So I was interesting what Margaret Atwood said when she said that the reason writers speak out is because they don't have a job. Because I've always had a job that wasn't an activist job until I was president of NAC, and that's when I was in my 40s already. So I always had a job. And I never cared if I lost my job or got fired because of my activism. And there was a time when I was in the pro-choice movement, and I want to start by saying congratulations to the women of New Brunswick for fighting for choice and to fighting for access to abortion. Because it must be really tough to be, well, along with PEI, the only province where abortion is so restricted, and you've really waged a magnificent fight on behalf of all of us, because we all know how easily those rights can be rolled back. So I just wanted to say that. So I never cared if I got fired from my day job because of my activism, and in fact, I almost did. When I was in the pro-choice movement, there were people on the board that tried to get me fired. There were people on the staff where I worked, which was at an agency, who organized to spread rumors about me using facilities to raise money for Dr. Morgenthaler. And it was becoming such an issue that my boss almost asked me to leave, which was a terrible experience. But nevertheless, I didn't care, because politics is the most important thing to me. And then I want to go to a thing Dion said, which is, she said, yeah, well, the risk is you're just so passionate, you do it anyway. And I think there's a generational difference there for two reasons. One is that, for me, I could always get another job. I never worried about getting a job. My generation, we didn't have to worry about getting a job. Like, I always knew I could get a job, one way or the other. I often worked in clerical work. I worked in a factory. I didn't need to have a professional job necessarily, right? I could always make a living, though. I didn't have to worry about that. And then the second thing was, the second generational thing, is that we had to fight to be who we wanted to be. Like, my generation, I'm the same age, almost the same age, around the same age as Rita, we had to fight to be who we wanted to be. We couldn't just be who we wanted to be. My first job, I tried to be a journalist when I left McGill, and the guy said to me, "We don't hire girls in the newsroom." It was a radio newsroom. And I said, "Why not?" And he said, "Because the men swear and they wouldn't be comfortable with a girl." So I said, "I don't give a shit if they swear." And he said, and then I was damned, doubly damned, because I was a woman and a foul-mouthed woman, okay? Now that's when I graduated from university. So we had to fight. And women, most women today, not all women, indigenous women, Muslim women, some African, some black women, do have to fight. But most white women, anyway, don't have to fight as women to do what they want to do, mostly, right? It's not as apparent, I guess somebody said. So I think that's a second difference about the risk, which I'd like to talk about more. And then the third thing is, we had more comfortable shoes, you see? I just wanted to point out the generational difference on the panel here of our shoes. No, I'm kidding. Okay, that's it. So I don't know if you want to talk about something else about work, but.
The main thing I have to say about work is it totally, and I'm speaking just very personally here, it totally defines me whether I am able to do my work. It's the only thing that wakes me up in the middle of the night worrying is if something will prevent me from doing my work. So there's been a lot of action. When I was a foreign-born woman and immigrated to these frozen shores in 1967, I immigrated from Manhattan to St. Thomas, Ontario, and it was quite a culture shock there. And my greatest worry, in fact, you'd say hello, and I'd say, "I don't have a job," because I was so worried about this. Ever since, I got those first jobs, and I too have always been a freelancer. Although I've dropped into academe from time to time, I did a few calculations. I've been working 46 years, and I've only spent 8 of those years in an academic institution. So that means the other time I've been a freelance artist, an actor, and television producer, and all kinds of things. And a lot of my activity has been about removing barriers for people like me to work. And I'm defining people like me fairly broadly. So a lot of my work has been about doing that.
I like this idea of talking about work because one of the other labels that I do call myself, but I'm very hesitant to put it out publicly, especially with around new people that I'm meeting, is also a sex work activist. And I use that term sex work to as a political, social, and economic term, that defining that, sex work is work. And there's also the term prostitution, which is used purely as a legal term and only to acknowledge that it's still criminalized and that it's still regulated by the state. And I think that when we talk about work, we need to learn to redefine work. And this theme that, especially from the past 2 panels, we're talking about choice. And often when we talk about sex work, there's the argument that says some of these women don't have the choice to enter into sex work. Well, you know what? Some of other people don't have other choices to enter into the other works that they do. So why are we so obsessed with this people entering into sex work as a way to make money? And I think that we need to acknowledge that, some people will do this kind of work in order to, provide for their families, to provide for themselves, to provide for whatever they need at that point in life. And when I talk about sex work within the public realm, it also, this mentioning of violence, that, there's a risk of increase in violence in just speaking out against it because, not only being Indigenous, but also being a woman and also identifying as a sex work activist, people assume that my body's just up for the taking and that they can do whatever they want with it. And that's not allowed. And we need to, look at how these definitions are applied and how people, negate some of these realities, and who benefits from that.
I think that's a good point about redefining work and how we see work. And one of the things is, like, our generation, we were the first generation, the thing you said, we were the first generation of women who defined ourselves by our work. Like, in my case, it was my activism, not my paid work. But nevertheless, we defined ourselves by the work we did, whether we were mothers or not, right? And so I find now that we're at retirement age, I find this with my friends. I noticed when my father was at retirement age, all the men got sick when they retired because they had only work to define themselves. They didn't define themselves by their family. And I noticed now in the case of my friends, they're not getting sick, they're just not stopping working. Like, they might not have their job, but they're still working just as hard as they were working when they had a job. And so I think that's something worth thinking about in terms of how it reflects on women. And then the other thing is, we wanted to work in the workplace. We wanted to have paid work. But we didn't define what our mothers did in the home as work, right? And so then we had, that whole debate, wages for housework debate and domestic labor debate and all that. But there's some way in which our generation, I think, did not value the work we do in the family enough, or understand the importance of it enough, and that that now, when Gloria Steinem says it took 100 years for women to get to do what men do, and now we have to have men do more what women have done. I think that's a big problem, right? And when Antonia says, where are the women? Well, part of the problem, there's a problem inside the workplace, but there's a big problem inside the family, because in almost all the families I know, with few exceptions, the women still take the primary responsibility in the family. Even if the man is doing, is co-parenting and doing work, the woman's still in charge in the family and takes the primary responsibility. So I think that work is a very important topic for, if you want, the next wave of feminism to figure out. And also because the paid work is changing so much, right? It's like very few people are going to have full-time jobs anymore. So
it's undergoing strange transformations that are difficult for us to grapple with.
yeah.
Do the rest of you want to add to that, or Crystal?
I have to vote on
Or yes.
Work, or the absence of work, which has been a theme in some of the papers this morning, that unemployment as another issue facing women who also want to intervene in the public. This last exchange has touched on two questions that we've raised for this panel, and I'll lay them both out, and then we can carry on that discussion and make sure we get some from the audience as well. Two things. As we discuss questions as an organizing committee, we wanted each panel to have somewhat different questions. And as Aretha said, we didn't want to end without talking about work, about making sure we talked about the body, and this has come up with the comment Naomi just made, and also in your work, the extent to which you've all confronted institutions. So whether it's Parliament, whether it's CRTC, whether it's the Academy, institutional confrontations. So I'll expand on both those questions, and then we'll turn it over to you, and you pick the one you want or pick both. But the first, in terms of the body, inevitably in our discussions thinking about the conference, body quickly tipped over into the issue of violence, and that feeling of the female body in particular in interventions in the public domain immediately sort of being open to threats of violence. Judy, we talked a lot about how you physically put yourself between Morgentaler and a man who was going to attack him. Like, you physically put your body at risk. And yes, and that was one that we thought, this really has to bring it up. We really have to bring that up. And Naomi, speaking with the Canadian government's Bill 362 law on prostitution, you emphasized and critiqued how in situations involving violence, just as you finished saying a moment ago, the law inevitably focuses on prostitution rather than on the violence. And then Rita, you've worked extensively in the field of broadcasting, and we see emerging new threats of violence enabled by new forms of broadcasting through the internet and bullying. So these concerns, and to the extent to which those, the body violence, the way you do your work, today creates new challenges for women when they think of intervening in the public. So that's that question. And then the second question, how you've confronted established powerful mainstream and public and political institutions like Parliament, like CBC, like the Supreme Court, the CRTC. So strategies that you have used that you might share about how you've dealt with that. So I'll hand back this mic.
Yeah, so I'll just comment. It's actually Bill C-36. It's entitled For the Protection of Communities and Exploited Persons Act. If you want to talk more to me about that, you guys can come up to me or you guys can tweet me. But the statement that I made, it was the importance of decriminalizing prostitution, especially in engaging with this conversation that prostitution is inherently violent. I sort of have come up with, that's an argument for criminalizing prostitution. And when we criminalize prostitution, we move away from focusing on the potential violence that some sex workers may experience. Not all sex workers experience violence, but if we do, sometimes that is used against us to say, well, you know what, maybe you should have not have been engaging in sex work, and maybe you would have never experienced that violence. And that's the same premise of Bill C-36. And engaging those types of, we have to turn the importance back onto, yes, violence may occur, but violence is only taken up by these institutions when it conveniences them, especially when it conveniences, especially gender issues such as prostitution. It's only convenient now because it's a Harper conservative government where they have religious issues, they have increased criminalization. This is an opportunity for them to appease their voters. And, as soon as they watch 2015, gender issues will be off the agenda. And that is exactly how we need to engage these institutions and say, hey, if you're going to pay attention to these issues, don't use them to your advantage. Actually engage in them meaningfully and respectfully and acknowledge our realities.
I'm going to come at this slightly differently from the way you asked it. First, I grew up in a quite violent part of the world. I am from Houston, Texas, and I lived there until the end of high school. So I think of violence on that level as part of my life. But in terms of work, I used to moderate a whole bunch of forums at the St. Lawrence Center Forum in Toronto. And these were free and open to the public. And we televised them on Vision TV, which is why I was moderating them. And we had threats of violence in a program about violence against women, and more threats of violence when we did a program with the two Irish women whose names I've forgotten, who got the Nobel Peace Prize. This is years ago. And so we got some security. But those two women suggested something that I had never. So here they've been in Ireland, where people are blowing each other up all the time, and they said, "Well, you just need a ring of women around the auditorium. We're talking about a big auditorium like this, and they'll link arms and." Stare anyone down who looks like they are going to give a problem. And we had a very peaceful forum. I had never thought of this. But I wanted to mention this in a completely different context, which is something we were talking about yesterday. These fora were free and open to the public, provided by the City of Toronto in a publicly owned facility. There is no more public space for that kind of thing. Those programs were completely canceled. And that's a kind, so the public space has shrunk for me, and I think that's incredibly violent. The other thing is, we've talked a lot about media and being part of media or confronting media or whatever. That's, the internet, I think, is only a tiny part of this picture. And the internet has many wonderful uses. But we need to be terribly concerned about the shrinking of the public space in media. We have been talking about it as if media has remained the same, and we've evolved. CBC, at this moment, has absolutely no money. In television, literally, no programs are being made. This is something I think we need to be terribly concerned about. Women made tremendous strides in media in the 80s and 90s, like they did in some other institutions. Now, 4 guys own everything, like they did in about 1960. And that's a kind of violence that I think, that I'm very concerned about, and I think we all need to be concerned about it. Especially the public sector in broadcasting, not-for-profit, virtually doesn't exist. APTN is, in fact, the only healthy not-for-profit broadcaster, which is wonderful, but there were other people making other contributions, and that was a good thing. And I've just talked about CBC, which is in a horrifying situation, and I don't say that because I love them. I say that because, in fact, frequently I hate them. But that public space in broadcasting is tremendously significant to the country, and we should be worried about it.
They have to be there for us to argue, yeah. Quite true.
Well, I'll start with the garden shears attack. It's also when I became a public person, really, was that day. And I dealt with a lot of violence in my life. I was sexually abused when I was a little girl, which I put away, and I was dissociative, which helped me deal with the guy with the garden shears, right? Because I wasn't afraid, because I couldn't feel fear. So I was literally fearless. You know, people are always saying I'm Judy Rebick's fearless as a compliment, but it's really it's a pathology to be fearless, you know? Like if you don't feel fear, something's wrong with you. You're not in touch with your feelings, right? And people are trained, like soldiers and riot cops, are trained to dissociate so they don't feel fear. Well, in my case, it was my survival mechanism. So and also I grew up with a violent father, so when that guy grabbed Morgenthaler, I didn't think about what I was doing. I just grabbed his arm and I pushed him. And then I felt rage, not fear, and I actually chased him down the street, which was idiotic. Like the pulling him away was smart, you know, and it was the right thing to do, and it was actually my job to do it because I was there to protect Morgenthaler. But the chasing him down the street was idiotic, okay? So it's not good not to be in touch with your feelings. But in any case, so in that situation, and you know, the thing you say of stepping, I didn't even realize I'd done that until I was looking at the clips the other day because I'm writing a memoir, that I actually stepped between him. I put myself as his target instead of Morgenthaler, right? So I really did that, you know, which was, I suppose, heroic, you know. But anyway, so what I wanted, and then as a young woman, I was very determined to do what boys and men did. And that meant that I dealt with violence, and I lived in New York for a time, in New York City, in 1968, which was a very violent time, and I refused to stay in the house or just be with a guy. And so I was assaulted, what we would call now sexually assaulted, although we didn't think of it then, we just thought of it as what you had to put up with if you were walking around the street alone, was guys grabbing you and flashing their penis at you and so on. I dealt with that all the time, and then I traveled around the world by myself when I was 22. And then I really dealt with a lot of violence, including someone trying to kill me, being stoned in Mashhad, literally. I was stoned a lot of the time, but stoned this way. But you know what? I never thought of that as violence against women because it was my way of coping. I just thought, well, you just have to put up with this because that's what it is to be a woman, and alone. And it wasn't until I was president of NAC and somebody interviewed me and I told him some of these stories, and then he wrote in his piece that I had been a subject of violence against women. Now, I was the president of the National Action Committee on the Status of Women. I'm telling you a story for a reason. And I did not think of myself and I knew, at this point, I knew my father had sexually abused me, but I didn't think of myself as a victim of violence, okay? Why? And I'm still working through that as part of writing my memoir. Why was because I couldn't admit that vulnerability and be strong. And I think this is still happening. It's one of the things Indigenous people are teaching us, is telling your story does make you strong after a while. Because when you first tell your story, when I first told my story, it's like this, which is not me. It's not what I think of as me, right? And so, and even, I even thought about, am I going to say this? Like there's a TV camera on and so on, like I'm always thinking, am I going to say this? Because, and I am writing about it, that's what my memoir is about, the relationship between what happened to me and the violence that happened to me and my strength, my activism, and how my activism saved me in many ways, including being able to defend myself and defend other people, right? So, it's the question of violence against women, who was saying, Antonia was saying she can't believe the persistence of sexism, but also the persistence of violence against women, like all this rape culture stuff with women being told you can't dress like that, you shouldn't drink, like Margaret Wente saying, well, they just shouldn't, what do they think's going to happen if they get drunk, right? Well, we fought, so what happened to me, which was a normal part of life, is no longer a normal part of life. It's no longer okay. And we fought to stop that. Now it's happening again in a different way, right? And so for me, the answer is the persistence of patriarchy, right? Which comes to me the institutional problem. When we, and stop me because I tend to go on and on, when we were in the early days of second wave, not everybody, there was a liberal feminist group, but most of us understood that we wanted to smash patriarchy. We want to end the whole system of male domination. That's what we were doing. But then as we got more successful, we got trapped into interacting with the state, right? We were winning things. But of course, we never really won what we wanted to win, so then we had to negotiate, then we had to lobby, then we had to, et cetera, et cetera. And in doing that, we lost track of, you could say we were co-opted, as if you wanted to be negative or critical, but you could also say we lost track of fighting the system, transforming the system. When I said this to a young friend of mine, well, a youngish friend of mine, she's in her mid-30s, I say young, and I think when I was young, we used to say don't trust anybody over 30, so she's in her mid-30s, and I started to tell her about consciousness-raising groups, which I think was kind of what Mary was raising. And consciousness-raising groups where it was a bunch of women sitting in a living room and talking about our lives and then developing policy out of that, And so one of the things we focused on was our relationship with men, those of us that had relationships with men, and how to change that as part of patriarchy. We understood all romantic love was part of it. Everything was part of it. But we lost track of all that to get into public policy, to get into representation of women, to get into those questions. Now I think a new generation is again raising these systemic issues, whether Idle No More on the Indigenous side or Occupy Wall Street. They're saying the system is the problem, or Naomi Klein's This Changes Everything. And I am thrilled to see that, because I've interacted with a lot of institutions, and I'm happy to get into that more. But I think it's harder now to get reform, and I think the problem is the systems, the patriarchy, colonialism, and capitalism. And we have to change those systems in a fundamental way if we're going to get any further as women. That's what I think. So.
You've said something really provocative, Judy.
Sorry,
that
what?
You've said something really provocative, that the institutions perform violence. So I'd like to hear what you two think is, well, I mean, it's true, whether it's the Supreme Court, whether it's the Parliament, whether, again and again, these places that we appear in front of and that we almost have to plead abjection to, and you're right, the system then takes over all of our desire for change.
I was happy that you mentioned colonialism, because I was like, oh, okay, she's mentioning patriarchy, let's keep going.
I said colonialism second.
But we wouldn't have patriarchy without all this colonialism first, right? So in terms of systems as violence, this, in a contradictory way, this is the one thing that I like about the Bedford decision is there's a specific line in there that says the state's role in violence in prostitutes' lives is not negated by third party or individual violence. And I'm like, that is so profound and important to talk about, because even in the Missing Women Inquiry done by Wally Opal, he states in there that the criminal regulation of prostitution leads to the marginalization of women. And he also states colonialism and the retrenchment of social programs. So it's really like we need to look at how these systems are marginalizing women's lives and realities and creating violence in their lives. And it's systems as violence, you know, that's like Indigenous women know that. Like, this is what we know. We know that policing doesn't save us. We know that policing doesn't protect us. And the history of the RCMP, which was, you know, the NWMP, which entire role was to help get rid of the Indian problem. So all this continuation of criminalization of our lives, including criminalization of prostitution, is systems as violence. So I'm really thankful that, you know, we brought up this discussion as systems of violence, because these are permeated and embedded in our society, and let's dismantle the system.
Or create some other systems. I tend not to talk very much about patriarchy, but to talk about power. And when Antonia was talking about more than half the women in professional schools, half the students in professional schools are women, more than half the people in newsrooms are women, but yet nothing changes. In fact, many things get worse. And I think the reason they get worse is because who rises to the top has not changed. And we need to be very concerned about that. So one of the things, I just happen to have one of my own plays here. I wrote a play. Playwright is a new occupation for me. I just took it up in 2006. And the reason is I was a 60-year-old woman who wanted to get back into acting. And I thought, nobody's going to hire me. That's ridiculous. So if I want to act, I'll have to write my own play. So I did write a play, and then some more. But the first one was called Smoked Glass Ceiling. Okay. So I described this little girl who grew up in Houston, Texas, and had a largely happy life. But then she comes to wanting to be a CEO. She's only a...
Does anyone ever want to be a CEO?
Really? This little girl did. She was a vice president, but she wanted to be the CEO. So she says, By 1997, I'd spent almost half a century living out my destiny as a queen bee until I'm very close to the top of the corporate heap. Now the top job is open. The head honcho, the big kahuna, the chief poobah, the man. I throw my hat into the ring and do that mating dance. The executive hunting firm says, you don't get the job because you have no previous CEO experience. We're only going to make an offer to someone with previous CEO experience. So for the first half of my life, the problem was racism. For about another 7 years, sexism. Now the problem is power. Gender, race, and power. These three remain. But the greatest of these is power. And that's where I think you're using that other P word, I'm using that word. So unless we have other models of decision making or create our own structures, and I'm a great fan of creating our own structures, actually. Sometimes you just can't knock down that wall, Chatelaine, and you have to move over here and do something else.
I agree with that, but I think that too often, I'm going to piss some people off here. I shouldn't say that because maybe I won't. But too often I've seen women get into positions of power and not do anything different, because in order to get into the positions of power, they have to make so many compromises that they forget why they're there, or they can't function there. Like I'd interviewed, for my book 10,000 Roses, unfortunately this part got cut out of the book, Frances Lankin, who was, without doubt, the best minister in Bob Rae's government. She talked about, that's in Ontario, she talked about how when she became a minister, she wouldn't let them call her Madam Minister, they had to call her Frances, all the bureaucrats, which made them very uncomfortable, and blah, blah, blah. And she tried to have consensus decision-making, but then the pressure on her was so much that she had to be a command and control leader, right? And so she had to exercise power in a way, in a patriarchal, what I would call a patriarchal way. She didn't want to, but she had to do her job well, and she wanted to do her job well. And so, therefore, I am much less hopeful about changing those structures which are created in these what Bell Hooks calls dominator cultures. These institutions are created in dominator cultures, and so they are created for the people on top to dominate, right? And that's a big problem. So if you're in that position, it's almost impossible not to dominate. So creating alternate structures is important, but then those people in power, and this is something I think about a lot now, those people in power don't want to give up their power so easily to alternate structures, and if you have any success, then they send the police and the military after you, right? So we have to deal with all that. I'm not suggesting deal with it now. But I mean, these kinds of questions, I think, are important to discuss, because now we're in a period of people power. I know it doesn't seem like that in Canada too much, but we are. I mean, internationally, we're having uprisings of people power that look very similar to each other around the world, which is really quite extraordinary, and that is a great advance that we can really connect with, a movement in Hong Kong or a movement in Turkey is it just blew my mind when I saw the people in Hong Kong putting their hands up in this gesture like the people in Ferguson are doing, right? It blew my mind. I thought, wow, it's amazing the way in which people pick up each other's tactics and pay tribute to each other's struggles. But we haven't got a new theory, and this is something maybe women can think about, a new theory of how to transform power rather than take power. And I think that's a big question for all of us.
That was the next question.
Oh.
How do you, as public women, what act can you undertake to redefine public service, critical thinking, collective work, and, as you say, redefine power?
Good question. Well, one thing is, just thinking off the top of my head, what I said earlier about the personal and the political if you want, right? I think is central to it. Like, I think that we had that idea, the personal is political, and that we have to externalize the personal. But I think Indigenous people now are taking it to another level, like the telling your story. And Occupy Wall Street, by the way, the Occupy movement did that too. Like, one of the big parts of the Occupy movement was people telling each other their stories and then going from there in terms of what people did. I think somehow we have to integrate that. Like, there has to stop being this role-playing that we do, that we're sort of this at work and this at home and this with our friends or whatever. That there's some way in which we're divided off in our culture that has to change. It's a kind of a European culture thing where you're in your head. Like, even, I don't know. I mean, I'm just still thinking about it. But anyway, that sounds very confused, but I am a bit confused.
Tell your story. Tell your own story your own way. But you need the space to be able to do that.
Or you need to create the space. Yes, I'm a great fan of alternative structures, and I suppose, in a way, I've spent my whole career trying to build some alternative structures, which last for a time, and then they don't, and you have to build another one. But that's okay. Making all kinds of alliances, I think, is tremendously important. All of the people who are concerned about the same things work with those people. Don't leave the Francis Lankins of this world alone. Support them. Let them know that you're behind them and you expect the few that peek through. And I don't worry so much about the police and those kinds of hostile military things. What I worry about are takeovers of successful alternative structures, economic takeovers, so that you need to know when you build an alternative structure that it has to stay in the control of the people who built it. That, in fact, is my main worry about APTN. As some people may know, I was asked in 2002 to be news director at APTN and to kickstart a daily news show, which is APTN National News, and so you can see it every night, and to mentor my Aboriginal successor. So I was there for 3 years and did both of these things. My worry, now that the not-for-profit sector has shrunk so, is that APTN is successful, which means that somebody will try to take it over, the same 4 guys who own everything. And the only way to keep that from happening is to know that it's a possibility. Because if I wasn't expecting it in things that so I finally learned to expect an economic takeover and to ward against it. So that's the other thing.
Yes. So I think for me as an Indigenous woman, like the issue is when we talk about power, we have to, in this space and taking up space, is that's like the essence of colonialism, is this taking up space and using this space for your benefit to do whatever, you have to do. And with social movements like Occupy Wall Street, that was hugely problematic because Occupy what? Where there's already people there that have, had that space, taken away from them. And I think we really need to acknowledge that people are already there in the space doing the work, and that people, whose history are we erasing and whose lives and realities are we dismissing when we say, oh, we're going to come and do this work and we're going to take up the streets and we're going to, get out in the public. And we have to, really acknowledge those realities as well. because also it's also the 1-year anniversary of the Elsie Bookduk RCMP raids that happened last year. And that was very vicious and violent raids done by the RCMP. And if you actually look at the hashtag Elsie Bookduk, ELSIPOGTOG on Twitter, you can see the violent images of the RCMP going in with guns, dogs, in camouflage. Like, that's not like being gentle with anybody. That's violent and that's vicious. And you know, like growing up, like this policing of our lives, especially as Indigenous peoples, is constant. Like even during the Oka crisis, I remember not being able to use the phone because the RCMP was tapping our phone. So we need to say, like, you know, I like the one comment that, you know, there's no more such thing as public space. Well, then we need to redefine all, you know, how are we defining space? How are we redefining power? Who is taking up these definitions? How are these definitions being used? And we need to be really careful, especially in terms of who's being erased within these discussions.
Questions? Crystal, you should steal Judy's. Do you have any?
No, I wanted to say we should turn to the mics and see if people in the audience would like to interact with the panelists.
Please.
I have a question. When Judy started speaking and saying that she wanted to talk about the title, I thought you were going to talk about the panel title. So that's my question, actually. And I'm glad that you didn't start there, because then I would have had to think of a different question.
I'm sorry?
I would have had to think of a different question if you had talked about the panel title. Okay. So the panel title is Revision, referencing in part Adrienne Rich's notion of looking at history with fresh eyes in order to move forward. But I want to pick up on what Naomi has been reminding us consistently about throughout this panel, and that is the absences and fissures in discussions that we're having both in public and in private space. And so I wanted to ask each of the panelists to take a moment and imagine that there's a colon instead of a slash, a backslash there, regarding vision moving forward after the end of the conference. What, for each of you, are the pressing ways, the pressing issues, peoples that we need to bring into these discussions in the nation now called Canada?
Big question.
The issues? Did you say the issues? I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question.
I'll give you an example then. So at the Polaris Prize Awards, Tanya Tagak was up on stage, did this incredible performance, had a choir behind her, musicians, and a scrolling list of names. And she said on Twitter, very probably well known for people who are on Twitter, I had a scrolling list of names of the 1,200 missing and murdered Indigenous women in this country, and people are all over me because I wore seal's fur, right? So that's one instance of a public performance in which we're not seeing what is right in front of us. And so I'm asking each of you to tell us what you think we should be looking for, talking about in these public discussions about women in Canada.
So just to comment on the 1,200 names, that was courtesy the RCMP, starting in the year, I think it's 1980, that, you know, we need to acknowledge that this isn't new, that the killing and murdering of Indigenous women has been ongoing, and that this is a pressing issue, that it's not an 80s issue, it's not a 90s issue, it's a lifelong issue, and that feminism, like for Indigenous peoples, fighting patriarchy, fighting colonialism has been since settlers arrived. And we need to acknowledge this, that it didn't begin with the suffrage movement, that it didn't begin with, 5 white women advocating for their right to vote and their right to sit in Senate. That's what we need to acknowledge, and this is important because, like I said, who are we erasing from these discussions when we only acknowledge 1,200 missing and murdered Indigenous women?
And what you highlight also has to do with where you're standing and what platforms you have. I mean, you have to use what you've got. I was Nancy's chair of women's studies at Mount St. Vincent for 3 years. And when I was asked to stay the third year, I said, well, I want to teach a class, I want to organize a class about Aboriginal issues where all the content is delivered by Aboriginal women. Not by, I have the contacts, but obviously I'm not an Aboriginal woman. So we did that, and these wonderful 5 women I brought in were, we also met with high school students, and we also had public lectures. And finally, we created a best practices kit where any group of people could sit around and work with the issues. That was a platform that I happened to have at that moment. And so that I thought was the most important thing to do with it. Other people have other platforms, and I think you have to go for the low-hanging fruit in that case. If you can do something that's related to and I was very pleased, actually, in the course, that my students were pretty familiar with what you just said. This isn't an issue that happened, 5 years ago. They knew this, and that was very, very gratifying. So you have to pick issues that you feel passionate about, platforms that you have or can create, and then make alliances with those who are working on other issues. Not to say that everything is the same, because it's not, it's different. But you know the people you can build alliances with and the organizations you can build alliances with. We've heard a lot of it in this conference. Pay equity is still a huge problem. Violence is still a huge problem. Colonialism and patriarchy is still a huge problem. And all of these things need to be worked on.
Yeah, I guess my feeling is that the way I see social movements is each one builds on previous ones. So if we're talking about indigenous struggles, like, yes, Europeans came in and imposed patriarchy on indigenous communities. And so that struggle began then for indigenous women. But there was also indigenous women involved in the early second wave feminism, so that they made, for example, the status question, because when indigenous women marry off reserve or marry non-indigenous men, they lost their status, and Mary Truax Early worked with the white, which was mostly white women's movement then, to fight that in the Canadian state, and that's part of the history. And then the missing and murdered women got, I don't think it was the RCMP who defined that, I think it was the Native Women's Association of Canada at first, fighting for that, and then the RCMP produced the name. So I think there's an interaction between all these different struggles. So with I mean, I'm not crazy about Persons Day either, for some of the same and some of different reasons, but I think when we acknowledge Persons Day, we do have to acknowledge the racism of the women at the time, but they did accomplish something, and that we are building on that legal accomplishment. So I don't think we have to wipe it out of history or say it wasn't important at all. And I think that, so I think that what academics call intersectionality, what I prefer to call what's happening now is convergence of a lot of issues, but we still have a what I call a white supremacist society. I don't think it's just white dominated. I think it's white supremacist. So the fallback is always the perspective of white middle class people dominate. And there's been a little bit of that in this conference. There has been. So there is some diversity, but not enough. And I know it's hard to get people to come, but why is it hard to get people to come? Because it's hard to be in Naomi's position, right? To argue a particular point of view in front of, I think, what is mostly white people. And so until we get, a way of organizing which is really inclusive, where there's, I don't know if there were indigenous women or women of color involved in organizing this. I'm not criticizing the organizer at all, because I think you've made a real effort, and we're talking about it. But I think that it's, I see it in organizations all the time. I walked into an anti-violence meeting of managers of shelters and rape crisis centers, which is where the anti-racist struggle started in the women's movement in the 80s, and it's 90% white in 2013. Okay, so persistence of racism in that way. And so I think these issues of making sure that we're thinking about all the different struggles and supporting all the different struggles is important. But I want to say one thing about the indigenous struggle, which is central. We live in occupied land. We live on land that was taken away from indigenous peoples. We live in a society created on the basis of colonialism, which is still oppressing and colonizing indigenous people. And that has to be at the center, I think, of our politics. It's not like it's the only thing that we can do, or we don't continue to struggle for other sorts of equality. And that's something I never understood. I've been involved in Indigenous solidarity since the 70s, but I never understood until Idle No More the centrality of that struggle to ever having liberation or equality in this country. It's the only way, because as long as we're living in a country based on the oppression of the peoples from which we benefit, we can't have equality, because we always say no one's equal until everyone's equal. So I think that's a real challenge that Naomi's putting out to us that we should accept. But I like to think of it in strategic terms, not just in moral terms. Like, because we're not going to be able to do what we want to do unless we do that. All of us, right? So.
Here's another question.
Hello, my name's Alyssa. I'm a fourth-year university student here. So in 6 very scary months, I'm going to be having to find a job in the workplace. So some of the stuff that you guys were talking about work and work culture and some of the male-dominatedness of that is really pertinent and has been really insightful for me today. And now I just have a question about redefining power in not only culture but also the workplace. Because when I read a lot of articles about how to be successful, in business and stuff, it's always about assert yourself, which, okay, I can assert myself, but it also says be the boss. When you talk to someone, have your hands on your hip and, be dominating. But those are all very masculine things, and I don't want to lose my femininity to be successful. So is there an equilibrium that we can find in work and culture that you support female identity and male identity both? Is there a modern day yin and yang that we can find, or is that irrelevant? Do we need to just push forward with female ideology? Yes, or is there this equilibrium, and would that equilibrium be relevant? Would that actually work? Can we find an equilibrium of male and female identities? Thank you.
We've saved the big questions to the end, it seems, not because of deliberately doing that. Who wants to begin with that one?
Well, as far as work situations are concerned, they're always hell when you first start. That's one thing that has to be said. And you can't, the goal, I think, is not so much whether people can be feminine or masculine or black or white or basket weavers. It's whether they can be themselves. Whatever that is, it's whether they can be themselves. So what you want to do as a worker is to do whatever you can to create that kind of workplace. That is, you're part of whatever the group is, and you bring your gifts to the group, and that's what you're after. But it doesn't happen overnight. It may not happen ever if it's the wrong workplace. But you still want to get out of that workplace with your dignity and yourself intact when you go to another one where those gifts will be more appreciated. So just, I think of it in terms of bringing your best self and your best gifts and allowing other people to do the same thing.
Okay, well, Margaret was talking about science. Well, the science of management is that the quality that is most present in successful managers is emotional intelligence, which women have in much greater supply than men, usually.
Well, they say that.
What?
But the science of management says that, but
Yeah.
does that really play out?
No, it doesn't. Yeah, it plays out in who's
can hear-
successful.
sorry,
It doesn't
you hear
play
my
out in what
frustration.
is expected, right? So I'm somebody who completely constructed myself as a man, in order to be successful in the world. That's what I did. And I have to really practice being vulnerable or saying I don't know or, I'm better at being more loving now, but, I constructed myself to be a man. I did. I really lost a lot in the process. And so I'm good at it, I know how to stand up to bullies. I know how to take space. I know how to deal, like I said, in those stupid debates we're having for Toronto mayor. I could slaughter those two guys, but I would be a lousy mayor, I assure you. So, whereas Olivia Chow has a hard time fighting to get in, and she'd be a great mayor, okay? So we still have these problems of sexism, right? But you have to think about what's important. Like, if what's important to you is to get ahead in a career where you have to be assertive to do that, then you have to learn how to be assertive. But if what's important to you is to be who you are and find a way to be who you are, then you have to find a job where you can be who you are, or find work where you can be who you are. So I think that's, there's something by adapting to the system, and that's true. Like in academia, I've seen it so much, right? Like in women's studies, for example, when women's studies started, and I have to say, when I was in university, we used to have cards in the library. I don't know, there's a few people here who might remember that. And if you looked under W for women, there was nothing. There were no books on women, no studies, nothing. Okay? And in 4 years of university, I read one book by a woman. It was Middlemarch by George Eliot, so I figured the professor didn't realize.
George Eliot has to call, yes, exactly.
Okay, so women's studies has revolutionized the academy in terms of the studies on women, not just in women's studies, but in all disciplines, right? But we also intended to transform the academy, I shouldn't say we, because I wasn't part of women's studies, but to transform the academy, to change it from a patriarchal kind of guild to something more democratic, more participatory, less and we did not succeed in doing that. And many women scholars have adapted to that because they wanted to be successful. And I think we have to challenge that now. I really do, because I think that we're at a stage where we have to challenge systems. And that means saying, no, I'm not going to buy into that system. It was easier for us to, tune in, turn on, drop out kind of thing. But I think now it's harder to do that because the risks are greater in terms of economic risks. But I think we have to challenge the systems, as Rita's talking about how she's been able to do that inside. I'm not good at doing it inside a system. I'm not. That's why I'm not in a system. I'm usually out of it. But, there are people who are good at it. We have to learn from them. How do you challenge those things inside a system and still be successful? And I think you can do it. I really do. I think you can do it. Find allies. Find mentors, and challenge. You were very articulate, this young woman who spoke about what you want to be able to do. So go and do it. Go and do it. Find the people who can help you to do it. They're around.
It also, I think, has to do
You'll be
with
happier.
how you define success. And we can, now, you have to keep the job, you have to not starve, and that's very important. You have to not starve. You have to keep the job long enough to have an influence on the workplace. I in fact, have a couple of people that I'm trying to counsel that they can't change everything. You can't die on every hill. Because nothing happens if you do that. So I have a couple of young people I'm working with on that. Pick your battles. Also, live long enough to have an effect. But if you decide how you are defining success, which includes eating, then over time, I think you can transform a workplace. And you can become the boss, and you can be a different sort of boss. You really can. Than the man you trained yourself to be. I have that style too. So one of the things that I do when I'm tempted to be the man I don't want to be is I get other people on the team who are better at it to take that kind of, like I hate making decisions by consensus. So rather than lie about how much I love it, I have somebody else do that. And then everything works out quite well. What do you think,
I'm not going to say stop reading those articles, but I'm going to say stop reading the articles. But if that provides you entertainment and, understanding, then continue reading the articles. But what I found really helpful for me, because I struggled with exactly the same thing. I'm like, oh my God, what am I going to do when I graduate? I don't even know. Was I enjoyed working on projects, and I enjoyed reaching out to other people. I enjoyed talking with other people and engaging in conversations, and that realizing that all the work that you do is not going to be paid, and that all the work that you do is, you must be able to learn from the work that you do. And it's not always going to be like, this is your job, this is what you're doing. But if you reach out to other people and you say, hey, you know what, this is really interesting, I'm really interested in your ideas, can I work with you? And, that may open up doors as well. And that's like real practical solutions that you can start working on right now. And probably at your school, there's somebody here that you may be interested in working with, or in the community, if those are options for you.
I don't know if this is on. I think we have to be mindful of that factor of time that has come up a couple of times during the course of the day. In a way, we've stolen back the 15 minutes we lost earlier on in the afternoon. We are not going to stop talking. There is actually a reception. We started the afternoon with art and science, and we thought we wanted, before people left, if they indeed weren't from Mount Allison, to have you experience the Owens Gallery, the wonderful Owens Gallery at Mount Allison University. So in fact, at this point, unless there's any further pressing thing, we'll just pause and we'll make our way to the Owens Gallery, where we can continue talking for another hour on many of the topics that we've brought up over the course of the today. So I'll just have everything say a last word.
I don't want the last word, because I hope this is the beginning of many more conversations and dialogues. And the women that I have heard here have been so moving and so great. So I'm going to cry. Thank you so much.
Thank you to the panelists. Thank you for being here this afternoon. We know it's 6:30, and as I say, please join us for a final reception.